Good morning, I'm harleysch from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for June 17th, 2021. Well, yesterday was the Biden-Putin summit in Geneva, and there were certain things that occurred there which I think you absolutely have to see as a step in the right direction. Not just that they talked, but there was a communique that they issued, which unfortunately has gotten very, very little coverage in what I can find in the English language press. I'm going to read you a portion of that statement, and then we'll be discussing that, because this is something which is a significant step in the right direction, especially when you look back 2 months ago, when it appeared as though we were headed toward a potential nuclear confrontation between the US and Russia over the situation in Ukraine. So the statement, which is called the U.S.-Russian Presidential Joint Statement on Strategic Stability, it was issued right after the summit. And by the way, you can find it on the whitehouse.gov, and you can also find it on the kremlin.ru websites if you want to see the full statement. It's not much longer than this, but the relevant point, they say, today we reaffirm the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So an open statement that neither side should ever fight a nuclear war. Now, here's the next interesting point about this. This is virtually the exact language from a communique issued following a summit between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, also in Geneva in November 1985. And that statement was issued while there was still an effort going on by the Reagan administration to win support from the Soviet Union for the Strategic Defense Initiative, that is the agreement to mutually deploy anti-missile defense systems to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, as Ronald Reagan said. And the Strategic Defense Initiative was a proposal that came from Lyndon LaRouche back in the late 1970s, at the point at which Zbigniew Brzezinski was running the Carter administration and provoking a potential confrontation over the idea of the arc of crisis. Now, in addition to that statement announces that they agreed to set up a bilateral strategic stability dialogue to work on strategic-related issues facing both countries. So they will put teams together to look at questions that include strategic arms limitations, as well as other contentious issues between the two countries. Now, granted, look, there was a lot that both admitted were unresolved. Biden accusing the Russians of cyber warfare, Putin denying it, Biden warning Russia not to allow Navalny to die in prison. Remember, Navalny put himself on a hunger strike that made him sick. But these kinds of issues, the charges that the Russians are violating human rights and so on, and I'm presuming Putin said some things to Biden about U.S. policy. And there are differences. And these differences were brought out very clearly in the pre-Putin-Biden summit discussions that went on with the G7, which included a lot of talk of the so-called Russian threat and the Chinese threat, the challenge, they called it, from China. And then NATO's summit, where they adopted the NATO Agenda 30, which is a beefing up of NATO forces and the extension of NATO as a worldwide organization. Well, it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was set up as a defensive military capability to deter Soviet aggression after the World War II ended and during the Cold War. The idea that there's still a NATO itself is a questionable one. But the language of NATO, of its General Secretary Stoltenberg, the warnings to Russia to stay out of Ukraine, when in fact Ukraine, which has defense and security forces that have had embedded within it actual pro-Nazi units, Ukrainian nationalists, whose origins go back to the Galician SS units in World War II that carried out ethnic cleansing against Romanians, Russians, Poles, and other ethnicities within Ukraine. These are people in the Azov Battalion, the Pravi sector, who are inside Ukrainian security forces, who were involved in the threats and attacks against ethnic Russians living in the Donbas region and also Crimea. And when the Russians stepped in to defend those people, I mean, you want to talk about racism, you want to talk about white supremacy, look at the situation with the Ukrainian SS units. And yet, this is considered somehow a violation of human rights when the Russians say that they're going to defend those people. And they didn't send troops in. There are all these charges they did, but where's the evidence? Just as there's no evidence that the Russians are engaging in state-sponsored cyber terrorism against the West. So this is important. They set up a committee on strategic stability to have an ongoing dialogue. Both Putin and Biden said this was an important agreement to carry on a discussion instead of just mutual recrimination. Putin said, "Our meeting took place in a constructive spirit." And Biden, and these were at separate press conferences, Biden said the tone of the entire meeting was good and positive. He said he knows Putin does not want a Cold War. They both agreed that the ambassadors from each country to the other, that is the Russian ambassador to Washington and the Washington ambassador to Moscow, which were pulled during the height of the Ukraine crisis, will now go back and engage in business. Putin said both sides expressed their intention to understand each other and to seek common ground. Now, how does the press treat this? Well, they went after Biden. How can you trust Putin? What assurances did he give you? It was almost a repeat of the kind of hostility the press demonstrated to President Trump in July 2018 after his Helsinki summit with Putin, where they insisted, why is Trump trusting Putin and not his own intelligence agencies? Well, we now know why. Because Putin was telling the truth about Russia not meddling in the U.S. elections in 2016, and the U.S. intelligence agencies were lying about that. That came out from the Mueller report. That came out from all the documentation that we have seen on Russiagate, more of which would have come out had it been publicly released and declassified by the Trump administration. We may never see that. We'll probably never see the depth of FBI, CIA, NSA corruption during that period. But we know that it was a lie that Russia hacked the democratic computers. A lie. The head of the cybersecurity hired by the DNC admitted they had no evidence of a Russian hack. And yet, what does the media keep saying? To this day, there was an Associated Press article on Putin lying when he said Russia doesn't engage in cyber warfare. And it said, because everyone knows what they did in the 2016 election. Well, the only reason people don't fully know about what was done in the 2016 election by U.S. intelligence is because the media covers it up to defend the criminal cabal that ran the Russiagate against President Trump. Now, another example, the Washington Post has an editorial that opens by saying that there have been reports of persistent cyber attacks by Russian state and private actors. Now, most of these reports don't say Russian state. They say private actors that live in Russia. But the question is never answered, reports from whom? What's the evidence? And then the Washington Post editorial concludes that while it was right to meet, there's no reason to believe that the outcome will vary from previous U.S. attempts at cooperation with Mr. Putin. Now, the U.S. media plays a particular role as running psychological operations against the American people. They lie, they censor, they engage in character assassination, they are a leak sheet for liars in the intelligence community who represent the forces of the City of London and Wall Street and their military strategic components, the so-called military-industrial complex, that actually are committed to provocations and confrontation, including the false flags, including all the lying about Assad's alleged chemical weapons use in Syria, which has been fully exposed as a fraud. The reports from Aaron Mate and others that show that the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the only investigators they sent into Duma concluded there was no chemical weapons attack, and yet they were censored. Those whistleblowers were never allowed to tell their story. And so just as the Russian hacking has become part of the lore of the present world, so does the Syrian use of chemical weapons with Russian backing. So we haven't gotten out of the woods completely on the war danger, because you still have some very crazy people in the intelligence community, the Defense Department, the diplomatic corps, who are spoiling for a fight, who are doing this on behalf of financial and security interests that don't want peace. But the fact that they met is significant. Now we'll see what happens to roll back some of the language from the NATO Agenda 30, the G7 phony efforts to build a competing entity to the China Belt and Road Initiative. We're still in a very dangerous moment in world history. But this meeting has some significance, and one of the ways you realize that is the vehemence with which the president is being attacked for something that he actually did, which was right, which was to sit down and talk with Putin. So that's my update for today. Tomorrow will be Friday. I'll take your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com.